So hi everybody. Thanks for coming to First Mondays here in Armstrong Theater or via the online stream if you're with us that way. As Liz just said, I'm Heidi Lewis. I'm an assistant professor of feminist and gender studies here at CC. And I'm pleased and honored to welcome and introduce Dr. Crystal Anderson, who's here to present Beyond the Chinese Connection, Contemporary Afro Asian Cultural Production. So just a little bit about Crystal and I before she starts. Dr. Anderson and I go back over 10 years to the English department at Ohio University, where I was a graduate instructor pursuing my master's degree, and she was an assistant professor. She's now an associate professor of English at Elon University, where she also serves as the academic diversity fellow. Dr. Anderson has published articles on Afro Asian cultural studies in several academic journals, including AfricanAmerican Review, Melis, Ethnic Studies Review, and Extrapolation. Her current work examines multiple facets of Korean popular music, or K-pop, in addition to traditional scholarship, such as her recently published book chapter on overlapping masculinities in K-pop male groups. She also works on digital humanities projects that use Omeka, an open source content management system to document and curate digital culture. One project, entitled iFans, Mapping K-pop's International Fandom, combines the curation of digital material produced by global K-pop fans with qualitative survey data and digital exhibits that are accessible to the public. She is also the project manager for KPK, the K-pop Collective, a collaborative research site that organizes information on K-pop and publishes jargon-free scholarly writing for a general audience by members that include librarians, graduate students, undergraduate students, and K-pop fans. To date, the site has received over 400,000 hits from the US, Philippines, Brazil, the United Kingdom, and the Republic of Korea. Currently, she's working on a book manuscript that's currently under contract with the University of Hawaii Press on the impact of rhythm and blues on Korean popular music. Today, Dr. Anderson will be presenting from her most recently published book, which explores the cultural and political exchanges between African and Asian Americans over the last 4 decades. In exploring the ways in which writers and artists engage cross-cultural conversations, she traces and tests the limits of how Afro-Asian cultural production interrogates constructions of race, ethnic identity, politics, and transnational exchange. So please welcome me in joining to the stage, Dr. Crystal Anderson.
Thank you all for having me here. I always enjoy talking about my stuff to people, and hopefully this will be an engaging and intellectually stimulating and enlightening and also maybe a little bit entertaining presentation for you. So my work is primarily very contemporary literature, film, other types of visual culture, but I want to start taking it kind of back in the day to give us a kind of different way of looking at ancient Afro-Asian connections or cultural exchanges, which then may inform the contemporary work that I do. So here at the top is a screen of the minstrel show that Commodore Matthew Perry had performed in 1853 when he opened Japan. It was commemorated in this screen. There's also a different screen that shows basically the same thing. It depicts not only white sailors, but also African-American sailors enacting a minstrel show. This is how this brand of racial discourse got to Japan, and if you know about Japan and popular culture, it is still in Japan. You can still find sample dolls on the street in Japan. This is kind of where it started. Over here down at the bottom are samurai at the Sphinx. I love this picture because I think, how did they get there? This is a picture taken in 1865 where a delegation from the Japanese feudal government visited Egypt after they had some meetings in Europe, and just that visual of the Sphinx, which is very iconic to Egypt with samurai at the bottom, I think is really stunning. Finally, over here is a map of the expeditions of Zhang He, who was a Chinese mariner, led expeditions from 1405 to 1433. He went to Southeast Asia, South Asia, the Middle East, and East Africa. He brought back, among other things, giraffes to China. These ancient and maybe not so ancient, depending on what your historical predilections are, examples of kind of Afro-Asian flows kind of disrupt our ideas of what the ancient and antebellum worlds look like. If we think about antiquity and we base that in places like Greece or Rome, then we don't get to these kinds of interactions, but they happen. We know that the Portuguese were sailing all around the place in the 1400s, even as far as Japan, and we know that they had sailors of African descent on those ships. So if this changes our perception of what the ancient world looks like, I want to bring that up to the contemporary era and talk about the bulk of what I'm talking about today. How does it affect the way we view interethnic dynamics now? How many people know who Bruce Lee is? How many people have seen one Bruce Lee film? How many people have seen all 4 completed Bruce Lee films? I ask this question to my students, and I get pretty much the same response, which just means that we need a seminar on Bruce Lee. But the book is going to have to do. So I want to set up the premise of the book for you in just a few minutes, and then kind of get to more visual and other kinds of media. People always say, write the book that you want to see. And the book that I wanted to see dealt with a lot of the Afro-Asian representations of Afro-Asian cultural interaction, but all I kept running across was a lot of books about the political implications of solidarity, the sociological implications about one group not liking another group, historical treatments of representations of Africans and the Chinese, for example. But I couldn't find a book that talked about the popular culture. And that, to me, was the one place where we didn't talk about what these kinds of representations meant. So I look at the cultural production. I look at novels, I look at films, and I also look at a Japanese anime series, Champloo, which we'll have a little taste of later. Besides all of the fun that sounds like, there actually is a theoretical foundation to the project. And that theoretical foundation is that we need critical tools to be able to dissect these complicated cultural interactions. So generally when people talk about hybridity, they're not concerned about the 2 things that come together. I want to take a chocolate and peanut butter approach to the 2 things that come together. When you put chocolate and peanut butter together, that's one thing. When you put chocolate and coconut together, that's something completely different. So first of all, we needed to look at the pieces in play in terms of what people were bringing together. In terms of Afro-Asian cultural studies, it seemed to settle on a binary. Either people are getting along, and that's the consensus model, or people are fighting, and that's the conflict model. And that's a binary, and I think it's more complicated than that, and there are different factors at play. The other theoretical piece that informs my work is cosmopolitanism, that once you take African-American culture out of the United States and put it in a different cultural context, you have to account for that different cultural context. It's not going to be the same. So we have to be cognizant of the kind of assumptions that we make about African-American culture when it's in the United States, and then when you move it to somewhere like Japan, Hong Kong, or Korea. So those are the 2 theoretical bases for the work, but let's talk about Bruce Lee. Saturday Kung Fu Theater. How many people know about Saturday Kung Fu Theater? Yeah, that's an age thing. Way back in the day, in the 70s, after the cartoons went off on Saturday, you could be treated to something. A lot of stations had this thing where they would show a Kung Fu movie after the cartoons went off. And oftentimes it would be some really bad Hong Kong movie like Chastity Ninja Kung Fu. But occasionally and there is a Kung Fu film called Chastity Ninja Kung Fu. But occasionally you would get something like Snake in the Eagle's Shadow with Jackie Chan, or Way of the Dragon with Bruce Lee. And I like to use Way of the Dragon to kind of introduce the idea that Bruce Lee is a lens through which, and his films are a means through which we can read various ways that African American and Asian American cultures intersect, because Bruce Lee means different things to different people. So, brief plot summary of Way of the Dragon. This is the movie where Bruce Lee's character, Tang Lung, goes to Rome. And so he arrives at the airport, he gets driven from the airport and see all of these, monuments that let you know that this is Rome. This is also the Kung Fu film where he fights Chuck Norris in the Coliseum with the little kitty cat as the referee. So this film is really great because it shows how 3 different groups could view this film in slightly different ways. For African Americans, Tang Lung's successful navigation of a racialized urban landscape resonates with African Americans because it mirrors the effect of a globalized economy on them. So let's break that down for a second. In the film Way of the Dragon, Bruce Lee's character is a country bumpkin, right? He dresses very traditionally. Rome is a very cosmopolitan place. The young lady that he comes to meet is very chic and very modern. She doesn't use her Chinese name. And so there's a cultural clash here. But the other thing is that Rome is a city, it's a bustling city. And there's a scene in Way of the Dragon in which Bruce Lee's character gets picked up by some random white woman, and she takes him back to her apartment. When African Americans view that, they see a very similar situation in the United States, particularly in the late 1960s, early 1970s, where the city has become a place where you have urban crime, racial tensions, and racial violence. So this is the tail end of the Great Migration, which starts in the 1920s and 1930s. It's all great. It's part of the Harlem Renaissance. We've got jazz. Everybody wants to go north to New York or west to Chicago. But by the time you get to the 1960s, the shine is off of that because now jobs are hard to find. There's lots of racial tensions going on in the city. And just like in the South, white women in Way of the Dragon are figured as problematic for men of color. So when African Americans see that, they see a resonance with their experience in northern cities where lucrative manufacturing jobs have left to go to overseas locations. And so there's a shift in the availability of jobs coupled with racial tensions and racial violence. And so when African Americans see Way of the Dragon, they see some of that reflected in the film. Hong Kong youth could view this in a slightly different way in seeing Bruce Lee's character represent the ability to maintain a distinct Chinese identity within a transnational context. So now Rome is a cosmopolitan city. And for Hong Kong youth, who are either Chinese immigrants to Hong Kong or the children of Chinese immigrants to Hong Kong, they encounter a similarly bustling metropolis, and they also challenge to maintain a Chinese identity. Now, when I say Chinese identity, lots of scholars have pointed out this is not an actual Chinese identity, it's more of an imagined Chinese identity. The idea that all of the Chinese around the world are bonded because we're Chinese. That's complicated, and we can unpack that a little later, but one of the ways in which this film resonates with Hong Kong youth of the late 1960s, early 1970s is in that way. The third way that Bruce Lee appeals to a group are Asian Americans. And Vijay Prashad talks about this in Everybody Was Kung Fu Fighting. He does a really good job of it, of showing how Bruce Lee challenges negative stereotypes of Asian Americans that are dependent upon negative stereotypes of Asians through things like the Vietnam War. So when Bruce Lee wins, Asian Americans win, at least in the movies. This is also contrasted with the kind of representations we see of Asians in popular culture, most notably James Bond's Goldfinger and a figure like Oddjob, in which Asian villains are prefigured as being very vicious, very bestial, and very violent. So Bruce Lee, one man, one film, at least 3 groups of people or 3 cultures that view him in very different ways. So, if this one film can do this, then this makes us more cognizant of who's watching the film, what historical and cultural issues are in play. So, let's move on to Enter the Dragon, which is probably the most popular Bruce Lee film. It was a co-production, Hollywood and Hong Kong, and it starred Jim Kelly, who was an African-American martial artist, and Bruce Lee. I like this picture. It's just a candid picture taken on set during the filming of the movie. This is particularly good because in the book, I argue that I look at 3 different kinds of interactions: Afro-Chinese dynamics, Afro-Japanese dynamics, and what I call Afro-Pan-Asian dynamics, and we'll get to that in a minute. Afro-Chinese dynamics are probably the one that proliferates the most. And in Enter the Dragon, I think we see the beginnings of that. So the plot of Enter the Dragon is there's a martial arts tournament happening in a secret location off of the somewhere in the vicinity of Hong Kong. Bruce Lee's character is sent in undercover as an unofficial agent of the British government, and Jim Kelly just shows up for a particular reason. And so I'm going to show a clip of why Jim Kelly's character Williams ends up at this martial arts tournament.
Going on a trip, are you? Hey, this jig's got a passport.
Where you going, Jig? Where's the plane ticket for?
Hong Kong. By Hawaii.
He's not going to Hawaii.
Well, look what we got here! Holding a police officer.
So Williams's presence at the secret martial arts tournament is precipitated by this racial event that happens in the United States. The scene right after this is a scene that has the other 2 main protagonists in the film, Bruce Lee and John Saxon, and they just arrived in Hong Kong. And Williams says, he looks around the harbor and he says, ghettos are all the same all around the world. In the scene before this, he's saying goodbye to his soul brothers at the dojo. And so you see black men practicing martial arts with a lot of African radical political iconography on the walls. Putting this scene in between those 2 scenes places Williams definitely in an anti-white discourse, which also puts him on the same side as Bruce Lee's character. So they end up forming a friendship as men of color in defiance of white authority, featured as male in this film. But that's all great and all, but it's not unproblematic. So let's take a look at another scene from Enter the Dragon, and we can talk about why when we have racial solidarity, it doesn't necessarily translate into other kinds of solidarity. So this is a scene at the secret martial arts tournament headquarters, and Williams is being offered some entertainment.
Mr. Williams. Mr. Williams.
For me? You shouldn't have. But I'll take you, darling. And you. And you. And you. Please understand, if I missed anyone, it's been a big day. I'm a little tired.
Oh, of course, Mr. Williams. You must conserve your strength.
So in the same film, we may have alliances between Bruce Lee's character and Jim Kelly's character, but we also have to do that at the expense of perpetuating certain kinds of stereotypes about black masculinity, unlimited sexual appetites, and let's not forget the trafficker in this, which is a white woman in this scene. This is not something that stays in the 1970s. And it's one reason why we have to read these kinds of films, and they have an impact on the way we read more contemporary films. So let's take a look at this scene from Rush Hour 2.
You pick any girl for you and your friend.
Any girl?
Any girl.
Okay. I don't know where to start. I'll take that one right there. She got to come.
Oh, yes. She's very nice.
She is nice, but I hurt my back and my neck, and I need a little bit more massage, you know. So I'm gonna take her in the pink, too.
Oh, yes.
And let me get her, hey, baby. And then I'm gonna have her. Can I get her, too? And her right there, right there. She good with feet?
Oh, yes.
What are you doing?
She said I can have any girl I want in here, man. Calm down, wait a minute.
Well, hurry up.
Hey, what's wrong with you? You don't jump in front of a black man in a buffet line. Calm down.
Your friend have big appetite. Please, follow her upstairs into the quiet room.
Ain't gonna be no quiet room no more.
So we see the same dynamic in a far more contemporary film. We see the same exploitation of stereotypes of not just black masculinity, but Asian femininity, and the trafficking of bodies in this kind of way. So in just these few scenes in terms of Afro-Chinese dynamics, like I said, these proliferate a lot. You have a lot of films that will place an African-American protagonist with someone of Chinese descent, whether it's Rush Hour 2 or the film with Jet Li and Aaliyah. This Afro-Chinese dynamic, I think, comes straight from what we see in a film like Enter the Dragon that puts these two cultures together. But it's not the only way that we can talk about Afro-Asian dynamics. Sadly, my editor told me to take my own Roselle Brown chapter out of my book. But I wanted to show her a couple of her images because what I was going to talk about with her was the way that African Americans look at Afro-Japanese dynamics from an African American point of view. What I was allowed to keep in the book was to talk about how Japanese creative people look at Afro-Asian dynamics. And so this is a quote from the creator of Samurai Champloo. He is also responsible for another popular anime series, Cowboy Bebop, which incorporated a lot of jazz elements into the soundtrack, as well as the characterizations of the protagonists. And one of the things that he says is from the beginning of the conceptualization of this project, African-American aesthetics in terms of hip-hop, in terms of the music, and in terms of the beat, played a huge role in their conceptualization of the series. And one way this comes up is the first thing you see when you watch the series, which is the intro. And so I'm gonna let you see that now.
Strong like an angel, a samurai sword, the mental blade cut through flesh and bone. Though my mind's at peace, the word out of order, missing then the heat, life gets colder. Oh yes, I have to find my path. No less walk on earth, water and fire. The elements compose a magnum. Opens my motor, so piranha's amalgam. Steel peptide.
think with previous ways of looking at Afro-Asian kind of interaction, we would follow the people. We would want to see something along the lines of an anime series that had African-American characters and Asian characters in it, but that's not what you get with Samurai Champloo. But what I think you do get with Samurai Champloo is something that's equally important, which is the use of aesthetics that are aligned with hip-hop and African-American culture. So rather than following the people, you're following a visual aesthetic that we can all identify and trace back to African-American culture. And I think that's a different way of looking at Afro-Asian cultural interaction. Instead of basing it on people, you base it on aesthetics, whether they be visual or, in the case of Samurai Champloo, sonic. The last thing I'm going to talk about in the last few minutes we have left is this kind of Afro-Pan-Asian mode of Afro-Asian dynamics. And I just talked about the use of aesthetics to kind of affect an Afro-Asian cultural interaction. This is something that happens in the Matrix trilogy. I made my mom watch the Matrix trilogy, and she didn't quite understand what was going on, but that was okay, because apparently a lot of us didn't quite understand what was going on. But having watched the trilogy over and over and over again, one of the things that I noticed is that the Wachowskis took great pains to use settings or props to affect this kind of Afro-Asian visual aesthetic. So in the first topmost picture, you see Morpheus, and he's on a highway, and they've just actually finished a car chase, and literally, out of nowhere, he's got a sword. You know, you see holes in the cars. They've been shooting machine guns at each other, but he's going to whip out a sword. And so that's a very interesting kind of image to see. Also, down at the bottom is this well-known dojo scene where Morpheus is trying to teach Neo Kung Fu, but it happens in this very almost overdetermined Asian space. And so what I argue about the Matrix trilogy is you have all of these Afro-Asian pairings, lots of Afro-Asian pairings all over the place. And it's also interesting to note that this project occurs after the 1992 LA riots, which produced a discourse of conflict around African Americans and Chinese merchants. So if you looked at some of the sociological academic work that happened early, this is right after some of the newspaper accounts of what happened, more often than not you would see an explanation for the riots that pitted African Americans and Korean merchants against each other. Later, we have far more nuanced explorations of that, and there were multiple factors that went into that particular event. But this is a story about lots and lots and lots of people of color fighting against forces that are consistently figured as white, male, and in control. And part of that are these Afro-Asian pairings. The most interesting of which to me is Neo and the Oracle. And I want to play this scene from Matrix Reloaded. Just look at the way that what they're saying in this particular visual says.
Well, come on. I ain't gonna bite you. Come around here and let me have a look at you. My goodness, look at you. You turned out all right, didn't you? How do you feel? I know you're not sleeping. We'll get to that. Why don't you come and have a sit this time?
Maybe I'll stand.
Well, suit yourself.
I felt like sitting.
I know. So, let's get the obvious stuff out of the way.
You're not human, are you?
Well, it's tough to get any more obvious than that.
If I had to guess, I'd say you're a program from the machine world. So is he.
So far, so good.
But if that's true, that could mean you are part of this system. Another kind of control.
Keep going.
I suppose the most obvious question is, how can I trust you?
Bingo. It is a pickle, no doubt about it. Bad news is there's no way if you can really know whether I'm here to help you or not. So it's really up to you. Just have to make up your own damn mind to either accept what I'm going to tell you or reject it. Candy?
You already know if I'm going to take it?
Wouldn't be much of an oracle if I didn't.
But if you already know, how can I make a choice?
Because you didn't come here to make the choice. You've already made it. You're here to try to understand why you made it. I thought you'd have figured that out by now.
Why are you here?
Same reason. I love candy.
But why help us?
We're all here to do what we're all here to do. I'm interested in one thing, Neo, the future. And believe me, I know the only way to get there is together.
Are there other programs like you?
Oh, well, not like me, but... Look, see those birds? At some point, a program was written to govern them. A program was written to watch over the trees and the wind, sunrise and sunset. There are programs running all over the place. The ones doing their job, doing what they were meant to do, are invisible. You'd never even know they were here. But the other ones, well, you hear about them all the time.
I've never heard of them.
Of course you have. Every time you've heard someone say they saw a ghost.
So I know some of you are thinking, what's Afro-Asian about this? Well, part of it has to do with the way that you read Neo, portrayed by Keanu Reeves. Now, there are people who know that Keanu Reeves has some Asian heritage in his background, and so some people argue that he's actually an Asian American actor. And I talk about that in the book, but I also think that the kinds of roles in which he's been cast lend themselves to reading him as an Asian figure. So if you look at things like Johnny Mnemonic, he is almost always likes to be in these science fiction films in which he's literally, sometimes, surrounded by technology, and that plays into a techno-orientalist discourse in which Asian identity is conferred on people based on a relationship, a particular kind of relationship with technology. I argue that he's Asian because it's convenient for my book and convenient for my reading of these scenes. And in this discourse, in this conversation, the oracle's like, we need to work together. It's significant that the person that she's talking to is Neo, in which we've made these Asian associations with, but chilling in the back is Sarah, who is played by Colin Chow, and is also another Afro-Asian dynamic. Before this scene starts, he's talking to Neo, and he says, and I quote, "I protect that which matters most." These kinds of dynamics between Asian and Asian American men and Black women are not ones that we see very regularly, and in the book I argue that one of the ways that we can make sense of this is to look at it as part of the discourse of womanism, which is about helping all people, men and women of various ethnic backgrounds, achieve the same goal. So, you might want to watch The Matrix again and see how many Afro-Asian pairings you can pick out and see how that might change your reading of the film. But the book overall does try to envision, through looking at these different kinds of Afro-Asian pairings, these different ways in which Afro-Asian cultures come together, look at more complex ways of looking at inter-ethnic interactions in general, so that we can't bring a cookie-cutter approach to something that differs depending on whether you're putting together chocolate and peanut butter or chocolate and coconut. Thank you.